It's wonderful to be here. So as French laid out here, my roots are as a Coast Guard officer, and when we approach this concept of resilience, we're going to spend the next bit here trying to really flesh out. I realized as I look back on it here, this is sort of part of my DNA. The unofficial slogan of the U.S. Coast Guard grew out of its life-saving service roots were, you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. I'm like, sign me up for that mission. Right? But it was basically, you actually embraced adversity, embraced risk with this noble goal of ideally bringing somebody back in harm's way. And this was something that was quite appealing. I would argue that it's also got out of fashion. We started to deceive ourselves in the post-Second World War era, marched right up to the end of the 20th century, that we could eliminate risk if we put enough money, enough intellect, and enough muscle against it. And that should be our goal. We should get to a zero-risk world, because we can, is what we thought. And our comeuppance has certainly been in the 21st century is, guess what? Risk has always been, will always be a fact of life. In fact, how we manage it is really kind of the secret sauce. And that's something, in fact, Americans were historically quite good at, right through the Second World War. It starts to atrophy when we basically so myopically focus on eliminating risk that we stop being prepared for dealing with it when it manifests itself. And this change, I would argue sea change, needs to happen where we essentially grab back those roots. Okay? So I want to take you through a little bit here. Now this is something that's got in the headlines a little bit more. Tom Friedman, who you probably know is a columnist in the New York Times, did a column a couple of years ago in which he actually says this is the abiding strategic imperative of our generation. What containment was for the Cold War, resilience is becoming for our world here. And the simple reality of why that's the case is because we've become essentially a much more interdependent, integrated world, which by definition therefore means when there's a shock any place, it tends to cascade. But to help define this a little bit better, it also helps when you're trying to launch a new institute if you get the boss on board. I have our university president, Joseph Aoun, is helping us to define what resilience is. So this is a quick piece of propaganda that we have. Oh. Sound? Move on. Okay. Great. So here's our dilemma. It turns out that there is a lot of rewards for connecting. And what we've done that is acceleratively in timetable we call globalization, right? Really when this takes off in the Cold War era. Every time though we connect, we create a new dependency. And that creates a new interdependency. And as a result here, again, if we have a shock in any one place, it can reverberate across those systems. And as the complexity grows, we tend to get more and more blindsided by these disruptions. And so the need to be focused on, one, the reality, we can't prevent these disruptions from happening from all sources. They may be 1, 2, 3 removed, but they're going to impact on us. And then also having real skilled plans to deal with that is the heart of what I see as the resilience imperative. Now, we saw a very vivid illustration of this with the Hurricane Sandy story. I had a grant from the Sloan Foundation to go in and look at the lessons learned through the lens of the infrastructure and their interdependencies. Now, of course, what this picture captures very well here is the lights being out in lower Manhattan. But for those who've been in New York, how many folks in New York, Sandy time frame? Okay, a couple here. In any event, it was not just lights going out, right? The kind of impacts were, for the first time since the end of the 19th century, the stock market went dark for 2 days. We had problems with healthcare. It turns out 90% of healthcare now is taking place outside of hospitals. It's taking place at nondescript strip malls where people go for dialysis and go for there's potentially radiation treatment and so forth. And of course, we brought technology into people's homes that used to be in ICUs. And so one of the challenges here was that when we lost power, it cascades across the healthcare system, even when you had some capability in hospitals, and it turned out not to be really great in New York. You had the problem was that healthcare was actually being provided outside of hospitals, and there was virtually no plan. On the fuel side, turns out Metro New York uses a lot of fuel, 42 million gallons of refined fuels every day. The system that provided that fuel was unknown to the mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, unknown to the governors of New York and New Jersey, and unknown to the federal government. It turns out how that fuel gets to New York is 60% comes in by ship, 20% by 3 refineries, 2 in Newark, 1 in Philadelphia, and 1 by the Colonial Pipeline, which starts all the way in Houston and brings it up in deadheads basically in Newark. So what happened with Sandy is the harbor was closed, the 2 refineries in Newark drowned, the Philadelphia one shut itself down preemptively before the storm hits, which was a smart move. It needed 3 days to get back on. Power went out in central Jersey, took out the compressor station, and took out the Colonial Pipeline, as well as damage up at the end. The entire supply system basically collapsed, and virtually nobody had visibility onto it until it failed. All right, so these are some of the outcomes. But as a micro example, let's take this one of Goldman Sachs. Okay, Goldman Sachs is a pretty well-heeled company, and they did something pretty smart. Since they're located adjacent to the Hudson River, they realized that storm surge is actually an element of hurricanes. It might be a good idea to use this very high technology called sandbags and surround it by the doors. And it worked brilliantly. There they are, versus the rest of Lower Manhattan. They were just missing 2 things. People, that's exactly it. You can't run. It turns out Goldman Sachs doesn't make money by having dry, well-lit buildings. What the problem was, of course, was their function, which was their people. The people were not able to get there because the transportation system went down. And then telecommuting, that was their backup, but the lights were out not just in New York, but in Connecticut, and Long Island, most of southern New York, and New Jersey, and parts of Pennsylvania as well. So there was a mad scramble, in part because they were focused on the resilience of an asset without really focusing on the function, which was, of course, people, being able to be there and get there. Now, another example is across the street, literally across the street. Verizon, they didn't go for that sandbag thing. So they had a little problem with water in their headquarters. Now, this isn't just a problem because the executives can't get in. Here, the real issue is not executives. Here, the issue is telecommunications. And guess where we put that messy infrastructure? In the basement, of course. Why would you put it up where people can see it, put it right down in the basement? Now, engineers are pretty smart. And so what they did was when they actually put all this stuff in the basement, they surrounded this thing called conduit, okay? Now, even there, though, it can be rubber, can crack and so forth here. So they have another added feature, which is to put it under pressure. So the water's trying to get in to essentially go after that copper. What it would do is the air would blow it out. Guess where the air compressor was? In the basement, exactly. So they drowned the air compressor, which shut down that system, and basically they had hundreds of millions of dollars of losses associated with the telecommunications connections, which obviously had some problems. This is a very sophisticated technology company. How did they miss this? They missed it in part because they were checklists sort of in their approach, not thinking about function, and not thinking about why do I actually have the air compressor? Oh, to keep it dry. What would make it wet? Flooding. Okay, maybe the air compressor shouldn't be in the basement. Now, they did have pretty smart. They actually had the generators in the 7th floor, the fuel pump in the basement. So they literally had to run up and down the steps with buckets of diesel fuel, 7 floors, to keep the diesel generators going. Okay, you can see though the mentality, right? The checking of the list here. Do we have the fuel? Yeah. Do we have the generator? Yeah. Do we start? But not thinking about the function and continuity of function, and that's where they get blindsided. These are very micro examples of interdependency that very sophisticated companies sometimes miss. I want to give you a vivid illustration, though, of how this can have global scale. Anybody know where this is? Anybody fly in from here, perhaps, today? Okay, on the left there is Newark Liberty Airport. Engineers are brilliant. We want to make things efficient. So what do? We have the airport here to the left. This is the Jersey Pike right here, okay? And this is a rail that connects basically the railhead for the New England area here, and this is the port, Port Elizabeth, all within 1 mile. Great, very efficient. What happens if I have a problem in the port? I sever the transportation neck for the Northeast. But hey, we're thinking about efficiencies here, and that bad stuff's not going to happen, right? So let me take you through a scenario that causes me a little concern. These are global networks at the end of the day. So let's imagine a scenario where we have essentially a factory that makes sneakers in a place like Surabaya in Indonesia. And its job is basically get them to a market here in the US. And how does it do it? Through the intermodal transportation system, the conveyor belt that makes supply chains move. Let's say in this case, the trusted company, name brand company, seals the container, but the driver who picks it up doesn't do a direct beeline to the port. It basically pulls off the road and pulls into a dark alley there in Surabaya, and they pop the hinges on the door, they open it up so not to disrupt the seal, and they put a dirty bomb into the container and they close it up. By definition, it's a known shipper from a trusted source, and so basically all those boxes move usually unimpeded across everybody's national boundaries. So in this case, it would move from the factory, end up in the port, end up probably in a little coastal regional one like this, end up in a place like the ultimate mixing bowl for boxes, which is the Port of Singapore. Did almost 40 million containers last year, right, moving through this one port. And there it's loaded on one of these mammoth ships. The Maersk line here has 18,000 of these TEUs, 20 equivalent units, aboard them. And if you want to, then from there it ends up in a place like LA Long Beach. And LA Long Beach uses a lot of stuff, but not all of it. LA Long Beach means 40% of all the containerized cargo for the entire country. What it does in this case, though, is it loads it onto a train in the Alameda Corridor, goes all the way across the country to this place called Newark, Port Elizabeth. Up there is New York in the back line. And then the device is set off. Now, we would see a local disruption, right? A significant local regional disruption because of the impact on the transportation system, the throat again. But let's start to think through some of the consequences. Turns out Manhattan has about 24 hours of food, total. People like me commuted in there for 10 years will descend on New York like locusts. We come in and commute every day and we eat up the stuff off the shelves and we go home. And every day it's trucked in, primarily from Port Elizabeth, to basically refill those shelves. All that trucks you're hearing at night are not just the garbage trucks. They're just stuff loading the shelves again. Because space is really valuable. You don't have a lot of space to sit food around here. You're bringing it in every day. So when we start to lose this, we start to have those kinds of impacts. Now, not as many people go to Manhattan after an event like this, but you can start to see how this could become a problem. Okay, but the real issues here is actually the global impact. Oh, by the way, this stuff never happens. This is Tianjin, China, a year ago, August. They had a little problem with hazardous materials. That's actually the most controlled part of the intermodal transportation system, right? Big hole in that city. The real problem is this. The system has increasingly become more concentrated into 20 ports that really matter. And so what happens here almost certainly will be a 9/11-like scenario where the US government, remember 9/11, dropped all aviation because risk felt unbounded. So the plan was bring it all to the ground and we'll sort it out. So let's imagine this scenario. The box goes off in Newark, and we know it came in from LA. What's going to be the political response? Almost certainly close the port so we can sort this out. Now let me start to take you through that scenario. 60% of the world's cargo containers are in motion right now. They're at sea. They're in motion. They're all soon to be low risk. Now we're going to instantly come into a catch-22. We're not going to let those ships come into the port, offload the containers until they've been checked, but you can't check them unless they offload them. So that starts to back up. Now overseas, you can't just keep putting stuff into a system that's backing up, so what do? You freeze overseas as well. Within about 2 weeks, the entire intermodal transportation system goes into gridlock. It locks down, and it would take, under the best scenario, about 30 days to restart the system, because you essentially have to reposition all the pieces in order to get it moving again, get back on schedules. For that, you would think we'd have a plan, because it's a low probability scenario. But you would think, given the consequence, bringing the global economy to its knees, maybe we should have a plan, for which we do not. We do not have a morning after plan for managing a scenario like that. Okay, that's something that companies are certainly affected by, but certainly governments and societies. So that's a local incident that starts to reverberate across the entire system, where some of it's not the destruction the terrorists did, it's largely the reaction or the overreaction by the political authorities who basically start putting new ingredients into the mixing bowl that causes and exacerbates the cascading effects. So how do we bolster business resilience? The stepping off point that I often found when I try to get folks to say, yes, we should invest in resilience, a little bit of what is it, okay? What it is this capacity we need to have to withstand disruption up to a point, and then when disruption happens, because they will, to be able to nimbly respond, recover, and very importantly, adapt, to learn, to basically restart that cycle. So resilience isn't a piece of that pie, it is really the overarching imperative. We want basically to assure continuity of function or continuity of business in the face of disruptive risk. And so we need to do stuff before, during, after in order to achieve that goal. And that has to be unified, not stovepiped, unified. So how do we get there? Well, part of the pushback often is, how can we possibly do it? And risks are almost unbounded. We can't even predict this stuff. We'll just cope when it happens. And Americans are pretty good at coping. We do that pretty well. But the fact is, there is a lot more that we know about these risks than we did in the past. There's a lot more we can do to get at this. But part of the pushback is, it's hopelessly expensive to think about how to do this. A key element is first breaking it down. What are we trying to make resilient? The function that we provide, okay? That may be, the business that we have. So what we need to do is break it into three parts: elemental capacity, essential function, and full function. Let's start with elemental capacity. It's basically what you have to have in place in order to produce the function. So that was my example of the air compressor. It doesn't produce any telecommunications. But if you don't have that air compressor, it's not going to keep the wires dry, and that's going to ultimately lead to real problems. So you need to identify what is the elemental capacity in basically allows my function to function, right? And that's something you need to safeguard. Next up is and a good story of this here is, this is another Sandy story here. What's the guy in the green sweatpants doing? And how is it going to buy gas? With his credit card, of course. So it turns out that pump is useless unless you have telecommunications that actually allow you to purchase, because who would have cash today, right? So this is a world where even something as basic as getting gas is a problem if you don't have that recognized of telecommunications, not just backup power, but those systems have to work. That's elemental capacity, right? It doesn't put any fuel in his tank, the telecommunications, but it's essential for the function to happen. Okay, on to essential function. There really is two key core ingredients. This isn't rocket science. First, is enough there that actually can support recovery. All right, you have to have enough function to actually recover function. And so there has to be a baseline. There's a big difference between having 0 power and 10% electric power. If the 10% is going to the right place, to the essential function, you can recover the rest of the function. Why this is so important is it allows you to do the cost-benefit analysis. It's not like I have to do everything to provide perfect functioning all the time. It is I have to break this problem down into this component here of the essential. That I need to think about how much I safeguard, and the rest of it I can recover more operationally to get me to, okay, and then the other is meeting the critical needs of your users. Okay, the full normal function is basically what makes you economically viable. Okay, there's a tipping point, right, where you're not back up and running, where you basically go away. So, how do you get to this? There essentially are, I've got essentially 5 kind of key elements here that you need to think about in building resilience. Okay, first up is this idea of cushionability. The second is resistance. Third is robustness. Next is redundancy and graceful extensibility, a little more clumsy word here. Basically, ability to adapt is key to this enterprise. So let's break this up. Cushionability basically is the ability to degrade gracefully. You're basically realizing, I'm going to take this assault, I'm going to take this insult, and I basically, if you have any warning, I'm going to degrade full function down to essential function to safeguard what's really valuable, to protect those crown jewels. Right? So if you have the means to be alert and have the plans for doing this, safeguarding it essentially by dropping that function down, because you know once the disruptive event happens, you can speed its recovery, then that's a sensible thing to do. So cushionability, so examples of this are hospitals that basically clear out non-emergency patients and so forth, so they have capability to deal with trauma and real injuries post the event. Highways that close down before the snowstorm hits. Not because that's function, right? You think about it, so all but emergency vehicles get off the road, right? Go to essential function. It's so you can clear those roads that much more quickly to get the traffic moving the next day. So these are the notion of cushionability. Resistance is I can't stop the hazard, but let me redirect it to a place where it's not going to cause as much mischief. All right, so I basically think about the hazards coming. Simple one in the wildfire scenario is I take down the trees around the substation. All right, I can't stop the wildfire, but it's not going to burn the substation. There's some fuel right next to it. So this is a strategy that basically looks at, can I redirect? The Dutch are really good at this whole way. They actually call it make way for the river. And it's basically an approach where they know the North Sea may come in, you can't stop it, so redirect it into places like underground garages and parks where it won't inundate the really valuable stuff. And then the water clears and you're okay. So the concept here of resistance is really looking at, I can't stop the hazard, but can I think about ways in which I can manage that hazard to make it go away? Next up is robustness, and this is sort of the classic we often think about, protection. It's really what you need to think about doing if you're looking at safeguarding the elemental capacity and essential function. You have two choices. You have harden or you got redundancy. You got a spare. Okay, and those though are not for everything. Those are for the things that are the elemental capacity and for the essential function. The rest of it, through operational means, we can recover back to that full function. Okay, graceful extensibility is a concept that's evolving here that engineers are essentially increasingly talking about resilient engineering, actually designing things knowing they will fail so that they will fail gracefully and also have the means to basically self-heal, to be able to come back. There's a head of our civil environment engineering department has been working on this, essentially putting structural fuses in buildings. He started this after the Kobe earthquake disaster in the mid-90s in Japan. What they basically are is, right now, is most buildings will survive the ground moving from a life safety standpoint, is that the girder system will not collapse and kill people in it. But the building will be totally trashed. And so effectively you have to knock it down and build a new one. The idea of embedding these structural fuses like electric fuses in the structure is that it absorbs most of that energy. So the ground moves, the building sways, they do it, they're replaceable, but then you can come in and you can re-occupy that building relatively quickly, repair it, get it back up. All right, that's a concept essentially of designing into your systems, knowing going to have this disaster, having this contingency that it's not a total loss. All right, the key with these sort of 5 variables here, though, is to start to break down this resilience, kind of notion into things that we can start to plan around, we can build around. Okay, putting it in practice, clearly you got to think about it before, very much so, during and following. The prior to is basically an element of modeling and simulation. Right? We have to map out these systems. And this is actually, I think from a business standpoint, we have some good data on this. Companies that actually spend time studying their functions, even if they have no disruptive event, end up being better companies. It turns out lots of people have no idea how their companies work. They have no idea what's elemental to it. They have no idea what's essential. They have no idea what's full. They just show up every day and they go to work. They're a cog in the wheel. When you basically come in and you put that group of folks under stress, saying, what if we lose this? What if we lose that? How does that impact? Almost always they find efficiencies or awareness they didn't know existed in the first place. And so the idea that we're sort of doing this as just, oh, woe is us, we're going to be ready for the big one, that's wrong. What you really want to do is stress your company in no part here because it lifts the awareness and understanding of its essential functions, and it starts to drive good behavior on blue sky days as well as give you contingency on the gray star days. So the key here is we want to model the systems, and then we need simulations that basically put people through what ifs. What if I do this versus that? Do I get a desirable outcome, or do I get unintended consequences? You can map those out. Okay, the idea here is you want to prioritize, obviously, the things that are the attributes that are really need to be safeguarded. Again, the essential elemental capacity, essential function, and the other things that are nice to have, you can have plans to deal with that. You also want, if you've thought through a scenario, you have to have good situational awareness that allows you to know if that risk is playing itself out. So the sensors have to be there. The data has to go to the right players. The problem you worry about is actually arriving. And all these contingencies we develop, we need to do. And so there has to be this situational awareness, operational capability built into your resilience enterprise. Okay, during the event, it's pretty straightforward. It's really about crisis management classically. Many, particularly financial companies, are pretty good at this stuff here. It's usually in the moment. But sort of the core things often that's missed is people part. It's amazing how much, when we think about resilience, again, it's focused on things like structures and buildings, and we forget the people element to this. A brilliant move by the MTA in New York City, by Tom Pendergrass, who just retired from the MTA, during Sandy, was 24 hours before the storm hit, he realized, I can't run a mass transit system without people. So he sent out all points to his employees, said, here's the deal. You work for me for the next 96 hours. I'll give you overtime, including the 8 hours you sleep. I'll find a cot for you, or you can go home. Virtually everybody signed up for the 96-hour deal. And so his entire workforce was on site after the storm cleared, and that led to, within 3 days, recovering that system, while New Jersey Transit was still digging itself out almost a month later. All right, basic element here. Remember, people, really important, and that's a critical part. Okay, the other is, having mapped out these dependencies and interdependencies, you've got to have worked out, those linkages, the communications plans. One of the real breakdowns is we contract a lot of this stuff out. And what turns out is everybody's contracted to the same guy, right? Because he went out and sold the same contract here, and guess who he's going to? The highest bidder, all right? And so if you're not aware of that, this one event is only going to hit this one company, right? All right, and the problem here is this actually happened on a state level. Right after Katrina, Hurricane Ike hit both Louisiana and Texas. And it turns out both had plans for using coach buses to evacuate people with no cars. And guess who got the buses? Texas. They paid more. They all went to Texas. Louisiana's sitting there going, whoa, whoa, whoa. No visibility of that dependency until afterwards, and then we have problems. Okay, following a disruptive event, the key here is, of course, we want to restore the elemental capacity, essential function. We're going to get normal function, and then we're going to learn. We can't just put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We're going to learn and adapt. I want to finish here with basically making an economics kind of case in a conceptual way. I can drill down on this here to help make the business case, but let's take things. The core of thinking about resilience is you're looking at function and how do I assure its continuity in the face of disruptive event. That function presumably has value, okay? If that function is your enterprise running and producing whatever it may produce, that has some value. What we know is when we have a shock, we're going to lose some function. And it's going to take us some time to respond, and then we're going to recover. And everything in red, basically, is loss. What we want to do with a very resilient system is be here on the left versus on the right. The left here basically is, I have this capacity to essentially gracefully degrade. I can basically withstand this thing well, so I have a small slope of loss. I nimbly respond, and I not just recover, I come back better and stronger because I have continued to do so. There's value here, right? This is the classic American approach. We have no plans, but hoorah, we're very good at responding. And so, down, everybody mobilize to get back, and go right back to where it was before, because it'll never happen again, right? We have a plan to safeguard, but no plan if it goes wrong. Okay, Deepwater Horizon-like deal. Okay, we got these things here, it'll never happen. Oops, it did. Anybody know how to deal with the deep sea bottom spill? And then that's a long, long time before we get back. This, unfortunately, is every small business, medium-sized business virtually, and small community. They get knocked down, they take a long time to respond, they never quite get back because people leave. At the end of the day, this is a competitiveness issue. In a world that's marked by turbulence, people are going to decide where they live and where they invest in the places that are most resilient, and they're going to flee those that are not. And if you're a company that basically can't demonstrate an ability to be resilient, during that event, you've lost market share and it's not coming back to you. And the one who's up and running, they're getting all your customers. Right? This makes sense in our competitive issue. There is no risk-free zones on the planet. If they are, you probably don't want to live there. Right? If you're probably where the action is, you're connected, you're interdependent, and therefore you're susceptible to disruptive events. If you're going to be successful in that environment, you have to make resilience an organic part of your enterprise. And this was an attempt to kind of flesh that out. So just to finish with what we're up to at Northeastern and the Global Resilience Institute is a university-wide effort. We actually have 9 colleges at Northeastern, from the law school and the business school to the College of Science, College of Social Science and Humanities, all the way along. All 9 colleges are involved in a university-wide effort to advance resilience because it turns out it requires an interdisciplinary effort. Engineers design stuff, nobody adopts them because there's no incentive to adopt them. There are no codes in place that reinforce those. So actually how to get the incentives to align and where the public policy mix and all that. And what's the underlying science that feeds that design? And what we're basically taking this on here is that you're going to make a contribution, you need to basically have all hands involved. Our goal here is essentially breaking this around, and what we have basically there are 5 barriers to resilience. Okay, what I identify here is I've yet to find an audience who basically somebody marches out because they're against resilience. You know, they want fragility and brittleness. You know, see you later. What the problem here is not that we want to be resilient, we just aren't, and we're getting less so. Well, why? So I've tried to break this around the barriers to resilient, and there essentially are 5. The first one is an understanding. We don't understand risk very well. We don't understand how risk will play itself out on the things that we value. That's a science problem, basically. It's a modeling issue. You have to figure out these complex systems, these second, third order. Things like network science are really helpful for this. Though now I got my academic colleagues are brilliant coming up with really complex models. The more complex it is, the more salivating they get. Useless for anybody in the real world, so we have to convert those into decision support tools to tools like visualization. In terms like gamers and media design people are really helpful, converting a complex model into something somebody might actually use to support what ifs. Okay, so the next step here is design. We have to design for resilience. Engineers historically, essentially have looked historically. They go backwards. 1,000-year event, 500-year event, 200-year event. Something goes wrong, add 20% safety factor, we're done. Now we're in a world where the uncertainty, if you get something longer than a 2-year or 1-year kind of cycle here, let's say a bridge you're building or a tunnel, whatever, you have to forecast that risk. And you have to design with some uncertainty. Make hedge bets. So some of the resilience design, example, rising sea level, we don't know if it's going to be 8 foot in Boston Harbor by 2100 or whether it's going to be 4 feet. We know it's going up. So you got to build a seawall, let's say, around something you want to protect. How high do you build it? Well, basic resilient design, a very primitive level, is you build a foundation capable of holding up to 10 feet, and you put 3 feet up first, but with the ability to add more as the data comes in. Right, so you design with the understanding here that you want this, the lifespan here, to be able to adapt to the risk that's coming its way. That's an engineering problem. Now we get an understanding, we have design, nobody's going to do a damn thing if there's no incentives for them to do it. That's a business economic problem, or the regulatory issues that may be in the way. And then we're not organized for this. We're organized around sectors. We're organized around cities and counties and states. Problem with Sandy, it sprawls across multiple jurisdictions. All the infrastructure is interdependent. And we're organized in ways that basically nobody sees the externalities. That's a governance problem. And lastly, we have to find a way to really share these best practices with industry that's going to own and operate the bulk of this, and governments that have to get their acts together to support this. So we've essentially taken those on as our 5 overarching goals. I would argue that's pretty much what we need to think about within a company setting, an enterprise setting, but it's one that we're trying to take on a university-wide level here to help provide the knowledge that will hopefully get us to a more resilient world. Last thing is to point out here is that resilience is something that actually has to operate at multiple levels. We know this intuitively, and it turns out there's a lot of insight. A lot we can learn from individual resilience. In fact, most of the work is done in the world of psychology and healthcare. What makes somebody more able to deal with the trauma than somebody else? So work around post-traumatic stress syndrome is giving us a lot of insight that are actually then applying to about the systems and networks. But the key here is a building block for any resilience here is your own employees, right? Have to be resilient. You have to have thought of contingencies. Are their families going to be taken care of if you're going to yank them away in the middle of your crisis? Well, how's that going to happen and work? But understanding that piece. There's also something I'm more and more interested in, which is aging gracefully. It turns out we're kind of tapped out on how old we can get. So it turns out the quality of how you age is an important piece. And so looking at how do we essentially deal with the growing assaults when we get older, probably get more frailer, but do it in ways we can withstand it and bounce back better. This is something that's, again, happening at that level. The systems level, the networks levels, like I laid out, I could go along here about how to solve issues like the global intermodal transportation system vulnerability. But one of the key elements here is understanding as a network, thinking about how you deal with it in a system-wide way. And then we have to do this at the community and societal level. So that's my story. What the final point I just want to make here is the world we're in today is a more turbulent world because 2 things. We're more connected. We've got all those benefits, and we don't want them to go away. We want the connectedness. But that is, again, dependency. The other is there are more hazards. We know from the natural environment, there's also, because of the interconnectivity, it does, again, creates more vulnerability in some ways. And there's also this man-made issue, as we saw just play out in the UK yet again. These are real issues that are not going away. Risk will be with us, and because as we become more interdependent, and here's why there's got to be treated with urgency at the societal level. At the end of the day, if we don't make resilience something that is our core, in our DNA, we're very vulnerable to essentially the kind of demagoguery, the living in fear and anxiety that leads people to freeze systems, to get escape systems. Why do people put money under the mattress during a financial crisis, right? They run away because that sense of the unknown. And if they start to feel that about the other things we depend on, the connectedness we need, on the information side, as well as the travel and the, in our interrelationships with other countries, all being so key. If it looks like basically there's more risk than there is benefit to most people, they start to run away from it, right? Then the benefits we've derived as societies over the last, I would argue, 60, 70 years can evaporate if we move into this anti-resilience age that we seem to be stepping into as well. With that, I'm going to shut up and hope that I've encouraged a couple of questions here or thoughts from all of you. Thank you. Anyone want to jump in? Own stories? Yes.
Question. You talked about across or at least the different individual groups that are there, or sectors, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah.
As you were pulling them together, what was your driving force? Did you have a top-down, or was it a collective, bring everybody together? What were your connecting points? That's really the story that we all have to figure out how to tell in our own organization.
Yeah, yeah.
What thread did you pull? And it's never going to be the same, but
Yeah.
you also understand what you did.
No, it's a really key question, which is really almost how do you prime this pump, right? Get it going here. Because everybody's busy on their day-to-day, so why am I going to do business differently? Well, the explicit example, what we did with Sandy is I'm trying to get Metro Boston more prepared for the same event. I mean, stay up for the grace of God. It turns out actually Boston is more vulnerable to storm surge than New York is and Lower Manhattan was. 7 feet of water will put the two main tunnels we have, the Callahan and Sumner Tunnel, underwater. They'll put 32 substations underwater. They'll put the MBTA's power farm, which we conveniently put next to the harbor, with its backup power in the same location. The Mystic Power Generating Plant, the main source of electricity, is on the waterfront, now uses natural gas, liquefied natural gas that comes in the port next to it. Right? So what I was able to do was to take that analog, which wasn't so far away. We're working with the head of emergency management for the state and saying, what if this happened here? Right? And so the immediacy of that event helped to drive, okay, I guess maybe there's something we should plan for. But the core issue was getting the players to come in from the energy and transport sector who'd never talked to each other. Right? And these are the utilities that never talked to the folks who bring in the liquid fuel system here, and as if these two were somehow disconnected. And what we were basically able to do is to get them in together here and talk about their assumptions about their respective vulnerabilities and almost always their false assumptions about the lack of vulnerability in other sectors. And once they became aware of that, it helped to energize I guess we may need a plan. I'm worried though about its sustainability in the absence of, we're talking with you, if we don't have the governor and the mayor behind it, I don't think it's a lot of heavy lifting and it's going to be hard to sustain the energy. So I'm worried that we're going to admire the problem well. There'll be, within the current group of players, there'll be a little more awareness, we'll make that good here. But if there isn't sort of a sustained effort to work the problem, and they were not well organized to do that, I mean, we're committed at the university to help this, but at the end of the day, if there isn't this sort of buy-in at the boss level, right? So that's a little bit of a dilemma here. I think, trying to make the case, as I try to do at the CEO level, that this is a competitiveness issue. This is, again, unless you believe you're in a universe, and many of them may be hoping that, because you're looking for next quarterly earnings, that, this won't happen on their watch. But if you're at all responsible with a major firm, you have to be in this thinking mode. Boards clearly have to be engaged on this as well. We're starting to see this around the cyber issue, and clearly that's a driver as well, where I try to draw some attention to the cyber physical. I mean, people got down pretty good, the whole vulnerability of IT systems and networks and, coming in to rob your data for financial reasons or business interruption. But it's taking down pipelines and taking out all the SCADA systems that operate on on this old hardware stuff. That's where we really get blindsided, and we really haven't even begun to tap on that. Yeah, you follow up? Yeah.
And that's perfect.
Yeah.
One tactical piece before that.
Yeah.
Did you use the situation of Sandy to broadcast to those group of people and say, hey, we want to talk about this relative to Boston? Yeah. Or did you just invite them and then you presented it there? It's to have to get them
Yeah.
to the door that they wanted to.
So we did two things that I think are essential to this, and this is something right now where it looks like we may get some longer-term funding from the U.S. government from. But post-Sandy event, when these major events happen, the locals usually learn, but nobody else does, unless through an old boy, old girl network. Hey, I heard you had a big flood there. Anything you might want to let me know about. So what we did is actually with the project we had here is I brought basically practitioners from outside Metro New York to New York to harvest these lessons learned. So I had people from Boston, Seattle, Chicago, LA, they went in there, and we basically, we weren't coming in saying, what did you guys screw up? We basically were, what would you like to tell these counterparts of yours that you learned? And people were much more open and candid with that. Boy, I wish I had done this. I wish I'd done that. So basically, that was a catalyst. And then having that, then it was easy, obviously, to go back and say, hey, should we take the conversation further? But one of the things we're getting support for is essentially we call them disaster tiger teams. These are practitioners who've got experience doing this work, as well as some experts who can go in relatively soon after the event, harvest these lessons learned, with the focus on resilience, not on the life safety stuff, but what could have, should have been done to withstand this and what can be done to speed recovery and adaptation, and help coach the people in the area and use it as a test bed for best practices. And the idea then is shine a light on that and hope you start to populate it. But you're spot on, the basic question here, right, is how do I get the leadership engaged on this? What's the motivation that's going to allow people who don't naturally come together around this challenge? And there's lots of different strategies. We're trying them all to get there. Yes, sir. Sure. Yeah. 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 So one of the things, so there's this tension, right? And not surprisingly, I'm in academia now, and boy, academics like their words. Right? And I often say there are a limited number of them in English, and we abuse them all, okay? So this is one it turns out virtually every discipline is using. Now they're using it in their own way. And so that might be, well, I better not basically, go down this rabbit hole then of trying to do that. I've tried to flip that and saying, look, you all get that this is a critical concept for your discipline. Let's get together here and figure out how what you use it for can help with the other players who are using it in a different way. I mean, can we use it as a way to essentially broaden the conversation? Because I need those various perspectives and disciplines to be a part of that. And if they're already sort of under the tent, there's actually a map I can share with you of a year ago, a study was done looking at all the referee journals where resilience was used for 15 years. And they have little web maps out. Every discipline basically is using it, some more than others. And so that provides, I think an opportunity here is actually to bring the enterprise together. But its core, I basically, I pushed the one I shared here was one that's in the, President Obama ultimately adopted as a part here, this capacity to withstand and then to be able to respond, recover, and adapt to disruptive events of all hazards. That taking it across the full continuum is sort of key. If that broadens out to look at long-term strategy culture, that's great. But I think the key for me was overcoming the emergency manager who were like, no, it's only bouncing back, it's recovering. As if they had no control over the design in the first place. I'm like going, engineers, they look at designing things to withstand. That's a resilient structure. Why would you not want that insight in that capability, right? So I think the key is not to wrap yourself up too much around the definitional issue, but as I've tried to lay it out with the one that I've been advancing and helped to advance within the White House, was this one that actually sort of encompasses. Right? Where I'm seeing here, and I can only imagine the challenges though, is a convergence in some cases between the physical security folks, the IT security folks, and the business continuity folks, which I've seen in virtually every major company are entirely different orbits with entirely different cultures. And it's like, wait, it's all about disruptive events. Some of the man-made stuff, the physical, cop on the beat who's got that job is doing here. There's the IT stuff, the nerds who can't talk to anybody, they're doing that here. Business continuity, again, thinking about the what ifs and what procedure, but the three aren't talking to each other? I mean, does that make sense? So, I don't know. I mean, I can see in some companies somebody going, I don't want to touch that one. This would be really challenging to try to get those different communities together. But I would argue that there should be real value to trying to, shotgun that marriage, drive each to realize that they need visibility on the other if you're really going to get the outcome you want, which is ideally continuity. So stressing it. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not. Other questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah. 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 So, I mean, I think that very first, that there are things that I don't know. I mean, that has to be the stepping off point, that you're saying, all right, we got to figure that out then. I think the way you do it is, again, you simulate the scenario, the stressor, right? You basically say, all right, what if this scenario played out? I want to take it to its essentially logical, outcome here. And then you start to see, whoa, wait a second, I have contracts supposed to do that. Is that contract really in place, and do they have other folks there? Or I'm relying on, that this capability in the transport sector is available. Hospitals have all gone to just-in-time, basically, supplies, because keeping them on shelves, they get shelf-worn, right? So what do? You basically have, well, that means mass trauma events, they're dependent on UPS and FedEx showing up that day. And guess what? Mass trauma events could be, you just lost your transportation system. And so some of these things are, you're having to force people to think through the what if under the stress. And it's not, again, because you're trying to plan for the worst. It's to put enough stress on that allows you to essentially hunt out some of those unknowns. And then when you do have an incident, turning every one of those into a learning enterprise, right? Because you are going to have these disruptions. I mean, one of the most basic practices that I like a major company does here, whenever they do a fire drill, that sort of drone experience, they turn it into a town hall and use that for Q&A with the, and get from the employees, what are they worried about? What are they apprehensive about? And almost always you're finding something out of that. Right? Using every time you have to do something, not from a compliance standpoint, but is there a way in which I can actually lead to some engagement here and learn something from others about what's going on. But the core issue is the dependency and interdependency issue, and it means the secondary and third order effects. And as we contract the hell out of everything that isn't core business, we're obviously creating real vulnerability. And that's not a problem if you thought through it, right? And you really have the right vehicles in place, but in almost all cases it's set up for blue sky, not for gray or black sky days. Anybody else? Well, I appreciate your time here today. I'll finish with my sort of rousing, I think hopefully here, it animates me. I think this is doable in no small part because it is back to the future. I made that case at the outset. But I would argue that every generation of Americans, from those who were here in the first place to those who came, did so willing to embrace risk and adversity. You didn't cross the Atlantic Ocean in the 16th and 17th century to avoid risk. You didn't land in this virgin continent and decide, oh, let's go west, young man, and do this to avoid risk, right? What they did by confronting adversity, and they were confronted by it, was in overcoming it, is they actually developed that sense of optimism and confidence about shaping the future. That ability to essentially make my life better and maybe others better was largely because they were confronted by stress, confronted by adversity, and overcoming it here. And so we shouldn't do this as a woe is us. It's about recapturing essentially what we always were pretty good at as a society, and then continue to be good at it because it'll be at a competitive advantage to do so. And I would argue our quality of life, our civil life particularly, will go up. So with that, I'll send you all on your way. And thanks so much for coming today.